The rope burns into Maria's wrists as the freight train's whistle screams in the distance. Margaret Whitmore, HOA, president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, stands over her with cold satisfaction. This is what happens when people like you don't know their place. But Margaret doesn't know that Maria's husband deployed 6 months ago or that his SEAL team just returned early from their mission. As the train's headlight cuts through the darkness, 3 shadows move through the trees. The hunter is about to become the hunted, and justice has a way of arriving when you least expect it. The morning sun casts long shadows across Willowbrook Estates, where every lawn was precisely manicured and every mailbox painted regulation black. Maria Santos knelt in her garden, carefully tending to the tomato plants that had become her lifeline during the lonely months since David deployed. The soil was cool under her fingers, and for a moment, she could almost forget the hostile stares and whispered comments that followed her every move through the neighborhood. Those plants are a violation. Maria's hands stilled. She didn't need to look up to recognize the sharp, authoritative voice of Margaret Whitmore, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of Willowbrook standards. Slowly, Maria rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her knees. Margaret stood at the edge of the property line, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. Behind her stood 2 other women from the HOA board, Janet Morrison and Carol Fletcher, their faces wearing identical expressions of disapproval. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Maria said, keeping her voice steady. "How can I help you? The vegetable garden?" Margaret's pale blue eyes swept over the neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Section 4.2 of the HOA covenant clearly states that front yard landscaping must consist of approved ornamental plants only. Vegetables are prohibited. Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "This is my backyard, Mrs. Whitmore. I checked the covenants thoroughly before planting. The garden is visible from the street." Margaret's voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to absolute authority. "That makes it a front yard violation. You have 72 hours to remove it, or face fines of $100 per day." "That's ridiculous," Maria said, her composure cracking. "My husband is deployed, serving his country. This garden helps me cope with your husband's military service, doesn't grant you special privileges to violate community standards." Margaret cut her off. Janet and Carol nodded in unison behind her, like backup singers in some twisted performance. Maria's hands clenched at her sides. "There are at least 6 other houses in this neighborhood with vegetable gardens. Why is mine the only violation?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's lips compressed into a thin line, and something cold flickered in her eyes. "Those other properties are established residents with grandfathered privileges. You'll remove the garden, Mrs. Santos, or face the consequences." The way she said the name, rolling the syllables with visible distaste, made Maria's stomach turn. She'd lived in Willowbrook for 3 years, ever since David made chief petty officer and they could finally afford a house in a decent neighborhood. But to Margaret and her circle, she would always be an outsider. The wrong kind of neighbor. "I understand the rules, Mrs. Whitmore," Maria said carefully. "But I'd like to formally appeal this decision to the full HOA board. That's my right under the bylaws." Margaret's laugh was sharp as glass. "The board meets when I call a meeting, and I see no need for one over such a clear-cut violation." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mrs. Santos, I've also received complaints about your music being too loud. The mariachi music you play while gardening. Some residents find it inappropriate for our community." "I play classical guitar music at a reasonable volume," Maria replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That's not how the complaints describe it." Margaret smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Perhaps you should consider what type of neighborhood you're living in. Some adjustments to your cultural expressions might help you fit in better." The words hit like a slap. Maria felt her face burn with humiliation and rage, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting into a shouting match would only give Margaret more ammunition. "I'll be in touch about the appeal process," Maria said. Margaret's smile widened. "Good luck with that." As the 3 women walked away, Maria heard Janet's voice carrying on the morning air. "I don't know why people like that even want to live here. They have their own neighborhoods." "Property values," Carol replied. "That's all they care about. Buy low in a nice area, then drag it down to their level." Maria's hands shook as she watched them disappear around the corner. She'd endured 6 months of this treatment, the complaints about her loud music, which was actually quite soft, the citations for her trash cans being visible for 30 minutes after pickup, the anonymous notes questioning whether she was really military housing approved. But this felt different, more targeted, more cruel. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Santos residence, this is Alina, Mom. It's me." Alina Santos had been Maria's anchor through David's deployment, calling every day from San Antonio to check in. Now her voice immediately shifted to concern. "Mia, what's wrong?" Maria found herself pouring out the morning's confrontation, her voice breaking as she described Margaret's barely veiled racism and the threat to her garden. The one thing that had kept her sane during the endless nights alone, Alina spat. "David should know about this." "No, Mom. He's got enough to worry about. The mission is supposed to end next month anyway. I can handle Margaret Whitmore. But as Maria hung up and looked at her garden, the tomatoes just beginning to ripen, the peppers that reminded her of her grandmother's cooking, she wondered if that was true. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just some petty HOA tyrant. There was something calculating in her hatred, something that suggested this was just the beginning. That afternoon, Maria researched everything she could about HOA appeals and resident rights. She drafted a formal letter requesting a board hearing, citing specific sections of the bylaws that guaranteed her due process. She documented the selective enforcement, photographing the other vegetable gardens that had never received violations. She prepared her case with the thoroughness David had taught her, treating it like a military operation. She hand-delivered the appeal letter to Margaret's house at 6 p.m., following the bylaw's requirement for written notice. Margaret's colonial-style home dominated the corner lot, its manicured lawn and perfectly trimmed hedges serving as a monument to HOA compliance. A Mercedes-Benz sat in the circular driveway alongside a BMW, both pristine and expensive. Margaret answered the door wearing a silk blouse and pearls, as if she'd been expecting company for dinner. Her expression soured when she saw Maria. "Mrs. Santos, how? Unexpected. I'm delivering my formal appeal regarding the garden violation," Maria said, holding out the envelope. As required by the HOA bylaws, Margaret took the letter between two fingers, as if it might contaminate her. "I'll review this when I have time. The bylaws require a response within 5 business days," Maria said, "and a board hearing within 2 weeks if I request one, which I do. We'll see about that." Margaret's voice dripped with condescension. "You know, Mrs. Santos, there are neighborhoods where your preferences would be more welcome. Have you considered moving somewhere more suitable?" The suggestion was delivered with a smile, but the message was clear. Maria felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "This is my home, Mrs. Whitmore. My husband and I chose this neighborhood because we believed in what it represented. Community, respect for our neighbors, the American dream." Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "The American dream, yes, but that comes with certain responsibilities, certain standards. Not everyone understands that. I understand perfectly." Maria's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. "I understand that you're using the HOA as a weapon because you can't legally tell me to leave based on my race. But I'm not going anywhere." The pretense of civility cracked. Margaret's face flushed red, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "How dare you make this about race? This is about property values and community standards. Something you people never seem to understand." "You people," Maria repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Margaret seemed to realize she'd gone too far. She straightened, resuming her mask of cold professionalism. "I meant people who don't respect established community guidelines. Don't try to twist my words. I don't need to twist anything. We both know exactly what you meant." For a moment, they stared at each other across the threshold, a battle of wills that felt like much more than a property dispute. Then Margaret stepped back and slammed the door. Maria walked home on shaking legs, Margaret's words echoing in her mind. The evening air felt oppressive now, thick with the promise of a storm. As she turned into her driveway, she noticed a white pickup truck parked across the street that hadn't been there before. The driver was too far away to make out clearly, but she had the unsettling feeling she was being watched. Inside her house, Maria tried to call David. The connection was bad, with static and delay, but his voice was a lifeline. David Santos moved like smoke through the darkness, every step calculated to avoid the crunch of fallen leaves or the snap of a twig. 15 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him that violence was sometimes necessary, but intelligence gathering always came first. He needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with before he acted. From his position behind the tool shed, he could see everything. Margaret Whitmore stood on his patio, rope coiled in her hands like a snake. The tall man flanked her left side. David noted the slight military bearing in his posture, the way he scanned the yard in sectors. Former military, possibly discharged under less than honorable circumstances. The woman he didn't recognize, Carol, stood to the right, nervous energy radiating from her in waves. But it was the fourth person that concerned him most. Margaret had mentioned someone named Jimmy watching the front. That meant this wasn't a crime of passion, it was a coordinated operation. They'd planned this, probably for weeks. "Last chance, Mrs. Santos," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying that same sing-song quality that made David's jaw clench. "Come quietly, and this will all be over quickly. Make us chase you, and we'll take our time with what comes next." Maria stood frozen by the back door, key in the lock, but David could see her mind working. She was assessing, calculating, just like he'd taught her. His wife was stronger than these people could imagine, but she was also outnumbered and trapped. Time to change the odds. David reached into his tactical bag and pulled out his phone, switching it to silent mode before typing a quick text to Jake Morrison, his swim buddy who lived 20 minutes away. Code red, "My house. Bring the team, now." Jake would understand. Code red meant lethal threat to family. It meant whatever he was doing, he needed to drop it and come armed. The tall man was advancing now, moving with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, lady. We're taking a little walk to the railroad tracks. What happens after that depends on how cooperative you are. Please, Maria said, and David heard the calculated tremor in her voice. She was playing weak, buying time, making them underestimate her. Pride swelled in his chest, even as rage burned in his gut. I have money. I can pay you to leave me alone. Margaret laughed, but there was hysteria in it now. This isn't about money, you stupid woman. This is about preserving what we've built here. You people come in and change everything. The music, the food, the language. Before we know it, this place looks like Tijuana. You people, the tall man echoed, pulling something from his jacket. A knife, David realized. The blade catching the motion sensor light. Should have stayed where you belonged. That was enough. David moved with the fluid precision of a predator, crossing 30 feet of open ground in complete silence. The tall man never saw him coming. One moment he was waving the knife at Maria, the next David's arm was around his throat in a blood choke, the blade clattering to the concrete. Margaret spun around just as the man went limp in David's arms. Ladies, David said conversationally, lowering the unconscious form to the ground. I'm Chief Petty Officer David Santos, United States Navy SEALs. You're trespassing on my property and threatening my wife. I strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action. Carol's face went white as paper. Oh God, Margaret, you said he wouldn't be back for weeks. Shut up, Margaret snapped, but David could see the fear creeping into her eyes. This wasn't part of her plan. You're just one man. Jimmy's got the front covered. There are 3 of us. 2 of you, David corrected, nudging the unconscious man with his boot. And Jimmy's about to have a very bad night. As if summoned by his words, a shout of pain echoed from the front yard, followed by what sounded like someone hitting the ground hard. Margaret's eyes widened. That would be Petty Officer Jake Morrison, David explained. He was a Marine Force recon before. He joined our team. Doesn't much like people who threaten Navy wives. David smiled, but it was the cold expression of a shark sensing blood in the water. Neither do I. Maria had recovered from her shock and was moving toward the house phone. Should I call the police? Honey, not yet, baby. I think Margaret and Carol here want to explain themselves first. David's voice remained conversational, almost friendly, but his eyes never left the 2 women. See, from what I overheard, this sounds like a conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder. That's federal crime territory. FBI, hate crime charges. The whole 9 yards. Margaret's composure was cracking like ice in spring. You can't prove anything. We were just trying to talk to her, with rope. David picked up the coil Margaret had dropped, and a knife, and a plan. To drag her to the railroad tracks? He shook his head. Margaret, I've interrogated actual terrorists who lied better than you. This is a misunderstanding, Carol stammered. Margaret said we were just going to scare her a little. Make her understand that maybe this neighborhood wasn't right for her family, Carol. Margaret hissed. But the damage was done. Oh, so this was your idea, Margaret? David took a step closer, and Margaret instinctively backed away. You plan to terrorize my wife because you don't like her ethnicity. I never said anything about ethnicity. Margaret's voice was rising, losing the cold control she'd maintained. This is about property values? About maintaining standards? Really? Maria spoke for the first time since David's arrival, her voice steady and strong. Then why did you tell me to find a neighborhood more suitable for my cultural expressions? Why did you suggest I move somewhere with my own people? David's expression went arctic. You said that to my wife. Margaret seemed to realize she was digging her own grave, but couldn't stop herself. I was trying to be diplomatic. There are neighborhoods where people with different backgrounds might be more comfortable. Different backgrounds, David repeated slowly, like being married to a Navy SEAL who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Like being a registered nurse who volunteers at the Veterans Hospital. Those kinds of different backgrounds. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Then what did you mean, Margaret? David's voice dropped to a whisper. Help me understand why you thought it was appropriate to threaten to tie my wife to railroad tracks. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Carol was crying now, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers. The tall man was still unconscious, blood trickling from where his head had hit the concrete, and Margaret Whitmore, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, was slowly realizing that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Jake Morrison appeared at the back gate, dragging a 4th man by the collar. Jimmy, David assumed a heavy-set guy, in his 40s wearing a Harley-Davidson t-shirt and sporting a rapidly swelling black eye. Package delivered, Chief, Jake said with grim satisfaction. This one was carrying zip ties and duct tape. Real amateur hour stuff. Zip ties? David mused. Margaret, that suggests premeditation, planning, the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors love. You can't do this. Margaret's control finally snapped completely. I'm the HOA president. I know people. Important people. City councilmen, police chiefs, judges, and I know senators, David replied calmly. My commanding officer plays golf with the attorney general. My last mission was classified at levels that would make your city councilman wet himself. So please, by all means, let's compare contact lists. The fight went out of Margaret like air from a punctured balloon. She seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. The reality of her situation finally penetrating the bubble of entitlement she'd lived in for so long. What do you want? She whispered. David looked at Maria, who nodded. Almost imperceptibly, they'd been married long enough to communicate without words. Here's what's going to happen, David said. First, you're going to sit down on that bench and wait quietly while I call some friends at the FBI. They have a whole task force dedicated to domestic terrorism and hate crimes. Very interested in cases like this. This isn't terrorism, Margaret protested. Conspiracy to kidnap and murder based on racial hatred, Jake chimed in. Lady, that's textbook domestic terrorism. You picked the wrong Navy wife to mess with. Second, David continued, you're going to confess everything to the authorities? Names? Dates? How long you've been planning this? Because make no mistake, this investigation is going to uncover every racist comment, every discriminatory action, every violation of civil rights you've committed. Carol was sobbing openly now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Margaret said we were just going to scare her. I didn't know about the railroad tracks. Shut up, Carol, Margaret snapped. But it was too late. Oh, so Carol didn't know about the murder part. David's voice was dangerously quiet. Margaret, that means you planned to kill my wife. And you recruited accomplices under false pretenses. That's conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, plus conspiracy to commit civil rights violations resulting in death. In federal court, that's life without parole. Margaret's face had gone gray. She was a woman who'd spent her life wielding petty power over HOA violations and neighborhood gossip. Suddenly faced with the reality of federal prison, the cognitive dissonance was visible in her expression, the slow realization that actions had consequence. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at the Willowbrook Community Center, her hands steady on the podium despite the sea of faces staring back at her. The room buzzed with tension. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years now, seeing each other through different eyes, the comfortable facade of suburban harmony stripped away to reveal the fault lines that had always existed beneath. My name is Maria Santos, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. 3 weeks ago, your former HOA president and 3 accomplices attempted to kidnap and murder me because they believed I didn't belong in this neighborhood. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Some faces showed genuine shock and shame, while others wore expressions of barely concealed resentment. In the front row, David sat with Jake Morrison and 2 other members of his SEAL team men who had taken personal leave to ensure Maria's safety during the investigation that followed. I'm not here tonight to seek revenge or to point fingers, Maria continued. I'm here because we need to decide what kind of community we want to be going forward. From the 3rd row, Janet Morrison, Carol Fletcher's replacement as interim HOA board member, raised her hand. Mrs. Santos, we're all horrified by what Margaret did, but some of us feel that this situation has been blown out of proportion. Margaret's actions don't reflect the values of this community. A murmur of agreement rose from several sections of the audience. Maria had expected this, the desire to treat Margaret's actions as an aberration rather than a symptom of deeper problems, but she'd also spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment. Janet, may I ask you a question? Maria's voice remained calm, professional. How many noise complaints were filed against my family in the past year? Janet shifted uncomfortably. I don't have those numbers memorized. 17, Maria said. I do have them memorized. 17 complaints about music that was never louder than normal conversation. How many complaints were filed against the Hendersons when they had their pool party last month with the live band? Silence. 0, Maria answered. Not one complaint. About music that could be heard 6 blocks away. But my quiet classical guitar was somehow a neighborhood disturbance. David watched his wife with fierce pride. The past 3 weeks had been hell. FBI interviews, media attention, death threats from Margaret's supporters across the country who saw her as a martyred defender of traditional values. But Maria had emerged stronger, more focused, with a clarity of purpose that was both beautiful and formidable. How many HOA violations were issued to my family? Maria continued. 43 in 18 months. The second highest total was 7, issued to a family who actually violated multiple structural covenants. But apparently, my tomato plants were a greater threat to property values than an unpermitted deck addition. A woman in the back stood up. Sharon Kelly, who lived 2 streets over. Maybe you're right about Margaret going too far, but you have to understand our perspective too. This neighborhood has a certain ... character. When that changes too quickly, it affects everyone. Character, Maria repeated. What character would that be, Sharon? Sharon's face reddened. You know what I mean? The type of people who fit in here. You mean white people, David said, rising from his seat. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Just say it, Sharon. Stop hiding behind euphemisms. That's not fair, Sharon protested. This isn't about race. Then what is it about? The voice came from an unexpected source. Elena Busquis. who lived on the next street over. She was a small woman in her 60s, someone Maria had occasionally seen at the grocery store but never spoken to. Because I've been watching this neighborhood for 5 years, and I see the pattern, the complaints, the violations, the hostile stares. It's not about property values or community character. It's about the fact that some of you can't stand living next to people who don't look like you. A buzz of conversation erupted. David could see the room dividing along lines that had always existed but were now being forced into the open. Some neighbors looked ashamed, others defensive, still others angry at having their comfortable denial stripped away. Tom Patterson, a retired police officer who lived at the end of Maria's street, stood up. I think we're getting off track here. Whatever Margaret's motivations were, she's gone. The people she recruited are facing criminal charges. Can't we just move forward and put this behind us? Put it behind us. Maria's voice carried an edge now. Tom, your wife called the police on my family 4 times last year, she reported, us for suspicious activity that consisted of having friends over for dinner. She claimed my husband was building bomb-making materials when he was assembling a garden shed. You want to put that behind us without acknowledging what it was? Tom's face went rigid. Nancy was being cautious. In today's world, you can't be too careful about what? David's voice cut through Tom's, stammering. About Navy SEALs, having dinner with their friends. About decorated veterans building garden sheds in their own backyards. What exactly was your wife being cautious about, Tom? The silence that followed was deafening. Tom sat down heavily, the weight of his family's actions finally settling on his shoulders. But it was the voice from the back corner that broke the tension. A young woman Maria recognized as Amy Chen, who lived in the newer section of the development with her husband and 2 small children. I want to apologize, Amy said, standing up despite her obvious discomfort with public speaking. My family has lived here for 2 years, and we've experienced some of the same treatment Mrs. Santos described. Not as severe, but the complaints about our cooking smells, the comments about our children speaking Chinese to their grandparents. I should have said something sooner. I should have supported you when this was happening. Her words seemed to break a dam. Other voices began speaking up. The Patels from Elm Street, talking about vandalism of their Hindu prayer flags. The Johnsons, and Black family, who'd endured years of subtle but persistent discrimination. The Garcias, whose mariachi band son had been repeatedly cited for noise violations while the white teenager's garage band had never received a single complaint. Maria felt tears prick her eyes as story after story emerged. She'd thought she was alone, that her family was the only target of the neighborhood's systematic exclusion. But the truth was worse and better than she'd imagined. Worse, because the problem was widespread. Better, because she wasn't fighting it alone. This is exactly what Margaret and her supporters wanted to prevent, Maria said when the testimonials finally died down. They saw our community becoming more diverse, more welcoming, more truly American, in the best sense of that word. And they decided to respond with terrorism. That's a strong word, Janet Morrison protested weakly. It's the correct word, David replied. The FBI's domestic terrorism task force is handling this case because that's exactly what it was, the use of violence and intimidation for political purposes. Margaret Whitmore and her accomplices are domestic terrorists, and anyone who supported or enabled their campaign of harassment is complicit. The room erupted into angry voices, some supporting David's statement, others protesting the characterization, still others demanding proof of broader complicity. But through the chaos, Maria noticed something encouraging. The diverse families who had shared their stories were gravitating toward each other, forming natural alliances across the previous divisions. When the shouting finally died down, it was Elena Vasquez who spoke again. I have a proposal, she said, her accented voice carrying clearly through the room. Those of us who want to build a truly welcoming community, let's do it. Let's form our own organization, separate from the HOA. Let's create the neighborhood we want to live in, instead of fighting over the one that's been poisoned by hatred. What would that look like? Amy Chen asked. Cultural celebrations, Elena replied. Community gardens where everyone can grow what makes them feel at home. Language exchange programs for our children. Neighborhood watches that actually protect all residents instead of targeting them. Maria felt hope blooming in her chest. A community association that actually builds community instead of enforcing exclusion. Count us in, called out Dr. Johnson from across the room. My family's tired of walking on eggshells, trying to be the right kind of black neighbors. Us too, added Raj Patel. Our children deserve to grow up in a place where their heritage is celebrated, not merely tolerated. As more voices joined the chorus of support, Maria saw the beginning of something beautiful, a real community rising from the ashes of Margaret's hatred. But she also saw the faces of those who remained silent, who watched the proceedings with expressions ranging from resignation to barely contained fury. The divide in Willowbrook Estates wouldn't be healed overnight. Some residents would never accept the neighborhood's changing demographics. Some would move away, following Margaret's example. Others would dig in, finding subtler ways to express their prejudices. But something fundamental had shifted. The conspiracy of silence that had allowed systematic discrimination to flourish was broken. The comfortable fiction that it's not about race had been stripped away, and the families who had been isolated in their separate struggles now knew they weren't alone. As the meeting wound, 1 year later, Maria Santos stood in the same backyard where Margaret Whitmore had once threatened her life. But the space was transformed beyond recognition. What had been a small vegetable garden was now a sprawling community oasis, beds bursting with tomatoes and peppers alongside bok choy and curry plants, herbs from 6 different cultures perfuming the air, children from a dozen families playing between the rows while their parents shared gardening tips in a beautiful mixture of languages. Mia, the cameraman, wants to know if you're ready, Elena Vasquez called from the patio, where a crew from CNN was setting up for the final interview of their documentary on the Willowbrook transformation. Maria nodded, smoothing her hands over the soil that had become sacred ground, not just for what had almost happened here, but for what had grown from it. The Willowbrook Community Alliance now included over 200 families from across 3 neighborhoods. The community garden was just one of their initiatives. Alongside the language exchange program, the cultural festival that drew thousands of visitors each year, and the neighborhood watch that actually watched over everyone, Mrs. Santos' reporter, a young black woman named Keisha Washington, approached with her microphone. "We're ready whenever you are. Please, call me Maria." She gestured toward a bench David had built in the shade of their oak tree. "What would you like to—" "No, I guess I'm curious about Margaret Whitmore," Keisha said as they settled in front of the camera. "She pled guilty to federal hate crime charges, received a 10-year sentence, and is currently serving time in a federal facility in Texas. Do you ever think about her?" Maria considered the question carefully. It wasn't the first time someone had asked, but a year of reflection had given her a clearer perspective. "I think about her every day," Maria admitted. Not with anger anymore, but with something more complicated. Margaret represented everything wrong with communities that value comfort over justice, uniformity over diversity. But her actions, as terrible as they were, forced us to confront problems that had been festering for years. "So in a way, you're grateful for what happened." "I'm grateful for what we built from it," Maria clarified. Margaret tried to destroy community through hatred. Instead, she created the conditions for real community to flourish. "I wouldn't wish what my family went through on anyone, but I can't regret the outcome." From across the garden, she could see David working with a group of teenagers from the neighborhood, teaching them carpentry as they built new planters for the expanding garden. Jake Morrison was there too, along with 2 other SEALs from David's unit. The men had become unofficial guardians of the community, their presence serving as both protection and symbol that America's military stood with diversity, not against it. "What about the other families who were involved in the harassment campaign?" Keisha pressed. "Carol, Fletcher, and the others." "Carol served 6 months and is now doing community service with immigrant resettlement organizations," Maria replied. "She comes to our community meetings sometimes. I think she's genuinely trying to understand how she got caught up in something so destructive." What Maria didn't mention was the letter Carol had sent 3 months ago, a rambling, tearful apology that revealed the depth of her shame and confusion. "I was so afraid of change," Carol had written. "I let that fear turn me into someone I don't recognize. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that seeing what we became has changed everything about how I see the world and the neighborhood itself." "How has it changed?" Maria smiled, gesturing toward the bustling garden where Amy's daughter was teaching Elena's grandson how to harvest cherry tomatoes while Dr. Johnson explained composting techniques to a group of new residents. "About 30% of the original families moved away after everything came to light," she said. "Some couldn't handle living in a diverse community. Others were embarrassed by their association with Margaret's actions. But the families who stayed, and the new ones who moved in, we've built something beautiful together." The camera followed her gaze to where Tom Patterson was helping Raj Patel install a new irrigation system. Tom's transformation had been one of the most dramatic, from a man whose wife had repeatedly called police on minority neighbors to someone who now coached their alliance's safety committee. "It wasn't easy," Maria continued. "There were months of difficult conversations, community meetings that went past midnight, conflicts over how to move forward, but we did the work. We talked honestly about privilege and prejudice, about fear and belonging. We learned that true community requires more than just living in proximity to each other." "What would you say to other communities dealing with similar issues?" Maria turned toward the camera, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had lived through hell and come out stronger. "Don't wait for a crisis to force change. If you see discrimination happening in your community or overt, speak up. Support the families being targeted. Challenge the systems that enable harassment, because silence isn't neutrality. Silence is complicity." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering the practical aspects of community organizing, the challenges of healing from trauma, the ongoing work of building inclusive spaces. But as the crew packed up their equipment, Maria found herself thinking about the deeper transformation that couldn't be captured on camera. Margaret Whitmore had tried to preserve a neighborhood where only certain people belong. Instead, she had catalyzed the creation of a community where everyone could flourish. The irony was profound, but so was the lesson. Hatred contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. while love and justice plant seeds that grow beyond what anyone can imagine. That evening, as the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, the community gathered for their weekly dinner in the park that had been built where Margaret's house once stood. The city had purchased the property after she fled, and the Alliance had convinced them to turn it into public space, a playground where children of all backgrounds could play together. Gardens where families could grow the foods that reminded them of home. A pavilion where the community could gather to celebrate their diversity. Before we eat, Alina announced to the crowd of nearly 100 people, "I want to share some news." The Willowbrook Community Alliance has been asked to help establish similar programs in 12 other cities across the country. Our model of community healing and inclusive organizing is being studied by sociologists and replicated by activists. A cheer went up from the crowd. David found Maria's hand and squeezed it, pride radiating from his smile. "But that's not all," Alina continued. "I also received a call this week from the Department of Justice. They want to feature our community reconciliation process in their new hate crime prevention training for law enforcement." More cheers. But Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. Recognition was gratifying, but she sometimes worried about their story being reduced to a simple narrative of triumph over adversity. The reality was messier, more ongoing, requiring daily choices to choose inclusion over exclusion, understanding over prejudice. As families shared dishes from their various cultures, tamales and samosas, collard greens and kimchi, pierogies and plantains, Maria watched the children playing together in the gathering dusk. Amy Chen's daughter and Dr. Johnson's son were teaching Elena's grandson a clapping game, while Tom Patterson's grandchildren listened with fascination to Raj Patel's wife, telling stories in Hindi and English. This was Margaret's nightmare made manifest. A community where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where children grew up seeing diversity as normal and beautiful, where the character of the neighborhood was defined by kindness rather than conformity. "Penny for your thoughts," David said, settling beside her on the bench where they'd shared their first kiss as homeowners 3 years ago. "I was thinking about the children," Maria replied. "How different their world is from the one Margaret was trying to preserve." Different how? Maria pointed toward the playground where kids were organizing some elaborate game that seemed to involve elements from soccer, tag, and what looked like traditional Korean dance moves. "They don't see differences as threats," she said. "They see them as opportunities to learn something new, to make their games more interesting, to expand their understanding of what's possible." David nodded, watching his neighbor's son explain the rules of cricket to a group of fascinated American kids, while simultaneously learning the finer points of baseball from them. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Margaret had chosen differently," Maria mused. "If she'd responded to change with curiosity instead of fear, with welcome instead of hostility. She might have discovered what we know now." David replied that diversity doesn't diminish community and enriches it. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake Morrison appeared with a folder in his hand and a grin on his face. "Santos family," he announced formally. "I have news that's going to make your year." "What now?" Maria laughed. The past year had brought a steady stream of unexpected developments: book deals, speaking engagements, award ceremonies, interviews with major media outlets. The White House called, Jake said, his grin widening. "The president wants to present you with the Presidential Citizens Medal for your work in